Pocahontas, Chapter 2, Part 2, we're beginning again on page 28. Certainly the town appeared peaceful. As a sign of welcome, Powhatan had ordered 40 or 50 platters of bread to be placed on the ground before his longhouse, and when John appeared, the Indians gave him 2 great shouts of greeting. Inside the longhouse, Powhatan was seated on his mats, smiling, surrounded by 40 of his wives, painted and bejeweled for the occasion. At the sight of John, Powhatan exclaimed again and again how happy he was. He moved over to make a place for John to sit beside him. Of course John had brought gifts, and of course Powhatan was eager to see what they were. There were 3 gifts: a suit of red woolen cloth, a high sugar loaf hat like the one King James wore when he wasn't wearing his crown, and a white greyhound dog. Powhatan loved dogs, and since he had never seen one like this, he made a great fuss over it. But where, he asked, were the cannon he had been promised? Rawhunt had refused them, John Smith replied. Powhatan laughed. He understood very well the trick that John had played on him. The next time John should find lighter cannon, he said. Then he asked about the Englishmen outside. Why were they there? Let them be brought in. John had told his bodyguard to come in 2 at a time so that the longhouse would never be left unprotected. Powhatan watched the guns file in with the soldiers holding on to them. 2 by 2 the guns came, so many of them. The men should put their guns on the ground, Powhatan said, to show respect. Only enemies asked them to do this, Smith replied, not friends. There is no mention of Pocahontas in John Smith's account of this visit, but surely she was there, smiling to see how John and her father played a kind of game with each other. Her father would make a demand and John would counter. Usually John won, but Powhatan did not get angry, for both understood the rules of the game. When Captain Newport arrived, Powhatan began the same game. He asked Newport why his men were armed. Weren't they all friends? Of course they were friends, Newport replied, and he ordered the entire bodyguard to retreat to the river. He didn't understand the game at all. When trading began, Captain Newport let Powhatan win every time. For a small amount of corn, he gave away 12 big copper kettles. Indeed, all Powhatan had to do was point to a hatchet, and the hatchet was his. Standing on the sidelines, John Smith was growing huffier and huffier. How could he ever expect fair trade again? John was the one who would have to see that the settlement was fed, not Newport. And look what he was doing. In desperation, John brought out some blue beads, a kind that the natives had not seen. When Powhatan showed interest, Smith paid little attention. These beads? He didn't have many of these, he said, and he really didn't care to part with them. These were a special blue, having taken their color from the sky. Only very important kings could afford to wear them. The more John Smith talked about the beads, the more Powhatan wanted them. In the end, John was able to wangle over 200 bushels of corn for a few pounds of the cheap glass beads. He made up for Newport's bungling, but he didn't get rid of Newport. Newport still had to find gold. This time, John Martin, who didn't like being called a cheat, was sure that he had found the real thing. Indeed, he got the men in the settlement so excited that they would do nothing but dig for gold. There was no talk, no hope, no work, one settler reported, but dig gold, refine gold, load gold. John Smith didn't even believe it was gold, but Captain Newport wouldn't sail until he filled his ship with what John called Martin's gilded dirt. On April 10, 1608, Captain Newport finally decided he had enough and he left for England. Along with him went Master Wingfield, Captain Archer, and Namontack, a servant boy of Powhatan's who was learning English and was to report on what he saw. Newport also took 2 tortoises and 2 ears of corn, for King James loved to get curiosities from the New World. Already he had 2 crocodiles and a wild boar, which Newport had brought from a trip to the West Indies. Just before Newport sailed, Powhatan sent him a gift of 20 wild turkeys and asked for 20 swords in return. Without hesitation, Newport handed over the swords and took the turkeys. After Newport sailed, Powhatan sent 20 turkeys to John Smith, and in the same way asked for 20 swords. John replied with a thundering no. Beads and bells, yes. A copper kettle, maybe. But swords, never. The Indians, however, were used to getting what they wanted now. If they couldn't do it one way, they would do it another. They would steal swords, if possible, hatchets, if they were handy. They even tried to grab weapons out of the hands of settlers. But when they attempted to surround John Smith in a cornfield, they went too far. Excuse me. Not only did Smith succeed in getting safely back to Jamestown, he managed to take 7 Indian captives with him. Powhatan tried to get the captives released, first one way, then another. Finally, he sent Pocahontas to Jamestown along with Rawhunt, some relatives of the captured Indians, and the gift of a deer. But Pocahontas was not to beg, Powhatan warned her. She was the daughter of a king. She should simply present John Smith with a deer and assure him of Powhatan's love, let Rawhunt and the relatives do the begging. So Pocahontas put aside her coaxing, frolicsome ways. She stood straight and proud as a princess, and in the end, John Smith and the ruling council agreed that for her sake they would let the prisoners go. But first, the prisoners must attend a church service. They had been required to do this every day they had been in Jamestown, and it is possible that Pocahontas, Rawhunt, and the visiting relatives went too. This time, those Englishmen who owned armor wore it to church as if they wished to impress the natives that their god was the god of war power. Perhaps the natives were awed, as the English intended them to be, at the sight of metal-suited men clanking up and down on their knees. Yet, if Pocahontas was there, she must have wondered at this strange English god who wanted no joy, no dancing, no shouting. Their priest did not even raise a sweat with his talking. Indeed, half the time he talked with his eyes closed. Surely, if Pocahontas was there, she was glad to get out into the sunshine again. She may even have turned a cartwheel before seeking out John Smith, who as usual, was ready to make her happy with presents. So we are going to pause here again at the end of Part 2, Chapter 2 of The Double Life of Pocahontas. We will begin again shortly on page 32.